So to start off, I want to share a prophetic word that I had received a couple years back. It wasn't a public thing, it was just a one-on-one thing. And so it's not one that any of you have heard except for maybe a handful of people I shared it with. But the prophetic word was that he said, I see you in the library of the Spirit. And I see God taking you to different places and volumes and books and basically just drawing from them as you want, like a library. They're free. It's free. No late fees, I've had a big problem with late fees at the library. My kids, I got in this thing where I would take my kids to the library because I wanted them to get into reading books. And I had a thing where I would take out a book and the return period was 3 weeks. I'd take out a book and my kids would take out like 30 books. And then inevitably we would misplace some, they'd get mixed up with our collection and the late fees. I've had to buy a few too many books from the library. It became pretty crazy. But anyway, this word was, you are invited and in the library of the Spirit, and you can draw from those books freely. And so a lot of times, as somebody who's just in, a church often and, teaching, and people hear what you're saying, people want to know, have you heard of so-and-so? Do you listen to this minister? Do you know this minister? Have you read this book? So on and so forth. And honestly, over the past 2 years since that word, the answer is probably no, I don't listen to that person or read that book. And it's not out of an arrogance or a disinterest. It's motivated by that prophetic word of, I want to draw from the things that God is showing me in the library of the Spirit. That doesn't mean that you can't glean from other people, and I'm not saying that that's something, if you need to be encouraged by certain ministers and help, by all means do that. But I'm saying for me, I have to draw from the library of the Spirit. I can't let my source be somebody else who is telling me what to think or what to do. That's my word.
Amen.
So therefore, I have to model my life and set up and structure under that word. You have words. This morning is about, I want to speak to you about the words that you have over your life so that you begin to accept them and receive them. And you don't hear the word on the one hand and say, oh, that's cool. But then your actions and the things you speak are contrary to the path that word wants you set on. So I want to start with a verse. It's Acts chapter 10, verse 15. And God says to Peter, do not call something that I've called clean common. Do not call something that I've called clean impure or unholy or common, would all be possible translations there. This was a message to Peter about food, natural dietary restrictions. What can I eat or what can I not eat? I'm a Jew. I'm regulated by certain things. If you're not familiar, listen to Mark Albin's song from the play. He runs you through the whole thing about, and he's munching on unclean foods at the table. The chronology was a bit off, but we made it work for what the purpose was, and it was funny. So, but yeah, Peter wasn't allowed to eat unclean food because he was a Jew and he was under the law. This was the moment at which God said to him, all food is clean. All food is undefiled. therefore you can take, kill, and eat. Was that just about food? No, that was not just about food. That was the precursor to what God was actually about to do, which was he was showing Peter, the leader of that movement at the time, a Jew, that all people are clean. Don't call anyone unclean who I've called pure, clean, holy. We need to receive that word of some of us, a lot of us are walking around thinking we're unholy, common, or unclean. God is telling you, do not call yourself impure, unclean, or common. You are anything but common. You are God's cleaned, circumcised heart, purified, righteous, and you don't have the right to say that you're unclean.
Right. That's good. Right.
So this whole thing is about labeling and what label you receive and what label do you reject and what label do you live by. And I'm not probably going to read any direct verse out of this, but if you're just looking for reference or trying to follow along, Judges chapter 6, it paints this backdrop of Israel it says that they are badly, badly oppressed. And so they're free from the Egyptians. They've left slavery. They've left Egypt. But now they've found themselves in a new kind of trouble. And it says that this people group, the Midianites, have them under such severe oppression that the people of Israel have nowhere to settle except caves and like little cliffs on mountains. And, basically they're boxed out with nowhere to go. They're oppressed with very little ability to sustain themselves. Obviously if you're in a cave or a mountainside, there's only so much agriculture you can do. And they start tossing around the word slavery again. Essentially that's the direction that they're heading in. Midian didn't formally own them, but they were so oppressed and dominated by them, that was pretty much what it had become. And they said to God, I thought that we were freed from slavery.
Right.
And so they begin to cry out because it says that anything that they did produce, the Midianites had said they were like a swarm of locusts and would devour everything that they had produced by their hand. So imagine that. All the productivity of your hand, everything you've set your hand to, somebody else devours it, takes it, steals your spot, steals your land, steals your position, displaces you. And keep in mind who this is happening to. This is Israel. They're God's chosen people. They're the people of promise. They're the people who are promised to have a land flowing with milk and honey. They're the people who are called to inherit vineyards and cities and all these things and to have a blessing over the things of their hand. What you set your hand to will be blessed, will prosper. They're living in the complete opposite, devoid of all of those promises from being manifest. And so as a believer, you need to remind yourself, I'm not going back to the old way. I'm not going back to the slavery way to sin. I'm not going back to cursed. I'm blessed. And so as they begin to call out, God calls Gideon. And he says to Gideon that I'm going to raise you up. to deliver Israel out from the hands of the Midianites. And Midian's response, it's easy to play that armchair quarterback, right, and judge his response.
Yeah.
But he says, well, how can that be? I'm from the weakest tribe, and I'm the weakest one of my family. So in other words, he's living out this label, this identity of weakness and defeat.
Yes.
And this is right in the face of God is telling him a promise, which is you are going to be the deliverer of your people. And he's saying, yep, I hear what you're saying there, God. But it can't be done because I'm weak and from a lineage of weakness. Some of these are natural things. Maybe he was from a family who, physically they were weaker people, smaller stature, whatever it was that he defined weakness as. It's a natural thing with spiritual implications.
Yes.
How you see yourself in many ways defines what direction you're going to go in.
So true.
If you receive the promise of God as you're a strong Midianite deliverer, conquering dude,
Yeah.
well then it doesn't matter that you only have 10-inch biceps. I just figured you'd appreciate the specific measurement. Not a lot of people would necessarily know how small a 10-inch bicep actually is, but I think you have a gauge. So, but God has to remind Gideon, it doesn't matter that you're of a weak mindset. If you receive my word, you could become the conqueror. You could become the person that we need you to be. I have a little story of my kids. I wish I thought of it earlier because we could have played the video. It'd be better. But when my kids were little, probably 2 and 4 or maybe 3 and 5, I was in a season where I would ride my bike to work pretty commonly. And so we shared one car. The idea was if I could get my butt to work on my own steam, then, Christy's freed up still. She has the car. If later on we want to reconvene, she's going to pick me up, we could do that. So that was the mode that I was living at the time. And so this day, Christy came at the end of the workday to pick me up with the bike. And she has this video, and she asked the kids, she's like, oh, Daddy's riding a bike. Do you guys want to ride a bike? And Leeson lets out the smallest, most pitiful 2 or 3-year-old squeaky voice of, I'm too little. And then Lucas immediately chimes in after him, I'm big to do it. And so, but that's how it is, right? Are you going to do the thing that your dad does?
Right.
No, I can't. I'm too little.
Right.
I'm too little to do that. Or are you the Lucas response of, I'm big to do it.
Yeah.
I'm big to do it. And that, ever since then, for the past probably 6 years, it's a common refrain in our household of, can you take out the trash? No, I'm too little. I'm big to do it. And so anything that you're asked to do, you could choose which way you're going to go with it. And it's really funny no matter which way you do it. But Gideon was too little initially to hear and receive the word of God. But he became big to do it.
Right. Yes.
He became big to do it. And the key here is it's hearing the word, but it's more than hearing the word. It's mixing the word and the promise and your hearing with faith. Hearing alone does not guarantee an outcome. Hearing and mixing with faith is what promises you an outcome and deliverance. So that's what ends up happening with Gideon. I think if you look back at your life, maybe back to when you were a real little kid, there's probably things that, attributes that people pointed out about you. You're smart. You're good at this. You're bad at that. Why are you doing this way? There's little experiences and circumstances. There's ways that your family raised you, ways that they acted around you. There's these things that form mindsets in a person, right? From a very young age of what you are and who you are. And you accept them. You walk them out. You say, yep, that's who I am. This is my identity. These are the things that I do because this is what all these cumulative experiences and comments and attributes have led to. This is what I am. This is what I do. And what I'm proposing this morning is that it isn't that you can scrap all of it instantaneously in a simple way, but everything that somebody's ever put upon you, every label that somebody's ever put upon you, good or bad, they all have to be brought subject and for review by God your Father. Yeah. All of it.
Every label. Everyone.
Maybe you were a really smart kid in school and you also really liked art, and everybody said, you're too smart to do art.
Right.
Be an engineer instead. And you became an engineer because the cumulative effect of a label pushed you in a direction, and it never even got offered to God of, you're a fantastic artist, and maybe you should be doing this. By the way, I'm not talking about myself. Terrible artist, reasonably smart. But yeah, the art thing was never really an option. But even that statement, I'm learning to reevaluate, because if God says you're an artist, then you are an artist. You're big to do it. So as a kid, I think I was maybe 6 or 7. One day we're playing out in the front yard. We're playing some kind of baseball-related game, but not like a full-blown game. Probably just practicing hitting. And I get this really, really, really aggressive, fast heartbeat that's like way out of proportion to the activity that we're doing. And my neighbor at the time, she was a nurse, and my mom gets her over. Actually, she might have already been over because we all played together anyway. But she takes my pulse, and she's like, this is very, very bad. Like, your pulse is like 220 beats per minute. Like, this is very unhealthy. It should never be this fast, and it definitely shouldn't be staying this fast without slowing down after multiple minutes of sitting here. And so that moment was when a label began to form about the health of my heart. And so, you do obviously, I think, what most parents would do in that situation of you want to get more information, so you go to the doctor first. And so then you get the diagnosis of, okay, your son has supraventricular tachycardia. Basically a fancy word for a really fast heartbeat that sometimes happens arbitrarily. Like, it doesn't have to be activity induced, and it doesn't necessarily slow down on its own. And some people, depending on the severity, it might take like an injection to actually slow your heart down when it starts to get out of whack. And it all has to do with like electrical impulses and misfirings and different things. But anyway, as a kid, you're growing up in a spot of, okay, I have this thing that's wrong with my heart. There's a medicine that you take now. You have to change your diet because you're not supposed to have caffeine. And God bless my mom. I mean, she's very, very caring, very, very attentive, definitely for her kids and doing what she knew to do at the time. But she took away chocolate milk from me as a kid. And back then, and maybe this is still a thing, you had to have a glass of milk every day, right? Otherwise, your bones were going to be weak. You were going to be like Gideon. You were going to be too little. You would not be big to do anything. And so you had to have your glass of milk every day. I hated milk. And so up to this point in my life, I could have chocolate milk, which is awesome. But because this heart thing, we were trying to make sure, well, if there's any control over this at all, we want to take control over it. And caffeine is a stimulant. Caffeine could affect that outcome. So no caffeine. I looked it up this morning. 2 milligrams of caffeine. It's like nothing in chocolate syrup. Cup of coffee is 95 milligrams. So it's like it was doing nothing but taking away my joy. And instead, as a poor substitute, I was given Ovaltine, which I forbid it from our household. But here's the point. I think you get what I'm saying. Over time, a label becomes a lifestyle. And as your label becomes a lifestyle, your lifestyle becomes your outcome. It all blends together. It just takes one off word, coarse word, one thing to sneak into your mind and start to set a course that's maybe astray of what God is calling you into. So I'm not blaming my parents for trying to do the best thing that they knew to do. But today I stand in front of you, and I want to say it's tricky because, as you know, I'm not a medical professional. So I don't want to give you liberty to do the things that I do necessarily. But if by faith you can cling to the way that I am, you might benefit from it. And that is, I don't live my life with regards to anything that I just told you. I've stripped myself of that label entirely. And yeah, there's no reference to it at all. I might finish this sermon with a glass of chocolate milk, in fact. And yeah, there's the way that I live my life and think of myself, there's no reference to you're a heart patient at all. I have a hierarchy of health that I think is scriptural, but it goes something like this. Priority number 1, if available, is 3 John, and that's to prosper in health and in soul. That's priority number 1. Number 2 is if something went haywire and there actually is an ailment or an injury, God, I want your instantaneous help and deliverance from this issue. Amen. Number 3 is the Paul to Timothy, your stomach's bothering you, take some wine. It's tapping into whatever natural wisdom, whatever the cumulative understanding of people about this issue is. If there's something you know that's going to help me, a medicine, a treatment, a therapy, then by all means, I'll take it if number 1 and number 2 have led me to that point. And the last on the hierarchy is if all else fails and you're really stuck in the sickness or the ailment, then it's a Paul style, well, because of my ailment and my injury and my condition, I'm with you. So I may as well preach to you. And so that's when you can go wild with preaching to the nurses or the doctors, whatever you need to do, whatever you want to do. But my point is, too many people start at the bottom portion of that hierarchy. And as soon as a label is available, it's accepted as a victim. And that's what I'm trying to defend against. Not utilizing wisdom, not using the hand of God. I want you to start in a mindset of God's got health for me and available. This is all going in a different direction somewhat than I had intended. Well, so I guess moving on with Gideon. Gideon says he's the weakest guy, right? Weakest tribe, weakest guy. What does God tell him to do? He tells him, tear down the altar of your father. Tear it down. What does that mean for us? My father didn't have an altar that I'm aware of. All fathers have a secret shrine, an altar that they don't disclose to anyone. No, but in this case, it was out. Who you worshipped was out there, right? It was out in the open and visible. And Gideon's dad was not worshiping the one true God. He had another altar and another means of worship. And Gideon was told, you got to tear that thing down. You have to get rid of that. And so by cover of night, he goes and he tears it down because he's afraid, but he still does what he's supposed to do even though he is afraid. And the next morning they see what had happened and they want to know who did it. And somebody blew him up. They knew what he did. And so they said, yeah, it was Gideon. And they're ready to kill him. They're ready to stone him for, dishonoring his father, tearing down this altar. It's very interesting, his father's response. His father simply says, yeah, if my altar can defend itself, let it defend itself. He sweeps it under the rug as, yeah, in other words, if that thing can work, if that thing is truly God and functional in this world, then let it stand on its own. And so Gideon gains this reputation of, he's basically calling out this foreign God to his people of, well, maybe this God doesn't have any power at all if he couldn't defend himself from weak Gideon. If weak Gideon could tear the altar down, then how powerful could it be? And if he's beginning to preach a message of deliverance by the hand of the one true God, despite his weakness, well, then we need to start to line up with this guy, because the way we're doing it is all wrong. And so for you, unless you've discovered your dad's secret altar and you're going to tear it down, it's about evaluating what's the altar of his soul? What's the mode of his living? What ways did he do things? What were his labels that have come to dominate his personality and his mode of life? And of those things, what transferred down to you today? And you have to begin to be willing to do that evaluation and then tear those things down. The key here is that It's not about a natural lineage in God's kingdom. It's not about the family that you're born into. If that's what it was about, then we'd still all be desiring to be Jews and going under the law. It's nothing to do with that. It's about, will you call God your father? Will you derive your identity from what he is and what he says about you? So I'll take James as an example out of the Bible. It's a little confusing because I wish God name person, just number them so that we know who's who. Instead, certain people have the same names. And it's like, oh, there's this Joseph here, and that Joseph there, and that Joseph there. But anyway, there was a James, and you could read in Mark chapter 6 that Jesus had 4 brothers and 2 sisters, and one of them was named James. If you read in John, I think it's maybe chapter 7 or 8, it talks about an interaction that Jesus has with his brothers, and they say, if you want to be a public figure, why don't you perform your miracles publicly? And it said they said this to him because they did not believe him. So in other words, the gospel version of James and Jesus' siblings, it's one of unbelief. They don't believe in what his brother's doing. They don't understand it. They don't look at it as from God. And Jesus is lumped in with his dad, right? Isn't this the son of the carpenter? The carpenter's son? And his brothers are here, and his sisters are here, and his mom is Mary. Isn't that Jesus? So his natural family, except for Mary, they don't get him. They don't know what he's about. They don't understand what's going on. They can't perceive it. However, later on, if you read Galatians, Paul says that he met up with 3 of the apostles, and he says one of them was James. And you might think, oh, well, that's open-ended. There's other Jameses. Not really at that time, because it says one of the Jameses was killed by Herod. And then also he goes on to say specifically James, the brother of Jesus, in Galatians. So that kind of tells you for sure, okay, it's definitely that. It's that James for sure, the brother of Jesus, who is now an apostle for Jesus. How did it happen? He went from unbelieving sibling to lead man, apostle, author of the book of James. The key, which is the key to everything we do, everything we operate in, it's in 1 Corinthians 15. And it's as simple as this. James became a witness to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. In his case, literally the witness of he saw his resurrected body, and that became the persuasion that was needed, apparently, to get him to go on an apostolic track. Think about that for yourself. Your natural identity is leading you one way. Maybe it's unbelief. But man, if you could witness the power of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, he could get you on a different track today if you accept it. If you lose the I'm too little stuff, and you say, I'm big to do it, I see that resurrection, and I'm big to associate it with it, he could put you on a different track. You know, for myself, a lot of you know, but maybe some of you don't. Married to the pastor's daughter, which makes my sister-in-laws also daughters of the pastor, and their husbands are son-in-laws to the pastor, and they're all ordained, and my older brother is also ordained, and there was a period of time I lived in a house with Pastor Dave and Katie adjacent to me, and Dawson was there, and Mercy was there, and KJ and Emily were behind me, and Jill was over this way, right next door. And then I'd go to work, and I could turn over my shoulder and see Jeanette Cole there. And it was like, oh, and by the way I got to work was riding with Frank. And it was like literally everywhere I turn, there's some strong, powerful, faith-filled believer. I can't go to this side of my family or that side of my family. I can't even get to work without being with somebody who's going to talk about faith. I can't look over my shoulder at work without knowing, oh, this is one of my disciples in a way who's here in this ministry because I brought her here. Oh, and then when you're home, all your neighbors are also. It was a ridiculous, it's a lot. But here's the point. Being in that spot does not guarantee you an outcome. It makes you no promise whatsoever of what your outcome is. The only promise of your outcome is if you choose to link yourself by faith to the Word of God for you and let it become alive for you, that any of that's going to be any help at all. Now, if you choose to do that, then all of a sudden that's a great safety net, social network, force field, protective thing that you're going to keep doing the right thing. But if you disregard the word, none of that's going to save you. None of it saves you. It's like James. The only way to go from unbelieving brother to apostolic track is, am I witness to the resurrection? It's the only way. You have to keep doing it. So with me, and I think I'll kind of wrap up with this. With this tearing down your father's altar thing. So I'll give you this one. So my dad, and sorry if this is boring because you've heard it before, but my dad's name was Joseph, from a long line of Josephs. Supposedly there were 17 of them that they know about. So unfortunately, they had this thing which they called the Haller curse. Terrible name. Yeah. Don't recommend it. So the Haller curse was, if you're Joe Haller, you die when you turn 40. Not on your 40th birthday necessarily, but you're going to die that year. Not for the same reason necessarily. It was almost like Forrest Gump, if you've seen Forrest Gump, where he's recounting oh yeah, my dad was in the military, and it shows all the clips of them dying in whatever it was, Korean War, World War II, World War I, Civil War. He shows all his ancestors dying in the military. So these Joe Hallers, just 40 was it for them. It was like an expiration date. And they called it the Haller curse. And so my dad was living in a mindset of, I'm under the Haller curse. And so, I'm 37 right now. Imagine that looming over you. Don't imagine it, actually. Stay away from it. But that's a short life.
Yeah, it is.
That's a short life. So as a kid, now keep in mind, it's not like when that whole heart palpitation thing came up, they said, oh, by the way, you're especially going to watch out for the Haller curse. But the point is, eventually, later on in life, when I became aware of this, it's like, oh no, I'm already having some heart trouble. Now I have this pesky curse to worry about as well. Okay. So I'm making jokes, but this is super serious. And this could be life and death kind of positioning and mindsets. Needless to say, I completely reject
Amen. Yes.
the Haller curse for it. It's just not a thing. And you could read in Galatians that it said Jesus became cursed. He hung on a tree, cursed. Well, why? So he could deliver you from the curse of the law. So you might be like, oh, well, that's a really specific curse that you're discussing. I don't know what my family curse is. You could probably figure it out without thinking too hard about it. How do the marriages go? How do the kids end up? How do you handle alcohol? How do you handle addiction? What's your level of success in your work life, family life, spiritual life? You can begin to look around and look at your history and figure out, oh, there's some stuff that's going on in my family that I need to disavow. I need the resurrection power of Christ to undo and invalidate whatever that curse is. That thing needs to be, I need to see that thing hanging on the cross and invalidated because he's called me onto a new path. You have to go after that stuff. If you leave it open-ended, years down the road, you might be surprised. Like, I didn't see it coming. But you could have. The other thing that I was thinking about with Gideon, the thing that stood in his way between grabbing hold of his true identity from God and living as that weak man, what stood in his way was fear. It said he was afraid. And I think a lot of times that's exactly what it is that's standing in your way. You might have a word of greatness over your life, but you're afraid of the sacrifice that maybe it will take. You're afraid of maybe what it'll make you look like in front of your brothers. You're afraid of, like Gideon, if I tear down the altar and reject this part of me, that I'll be rejected by my family. You're afraid that if you take that step out into something great, into something bigger that you're doing right now, that people are going to try and put a lid on you and stop you and limit you. You're afraid of the judgment of man. You're afraid. And so you don't attach yourself to the word of truth. But like Gideon faced that fear and he did the thing anyway. He tore down the altar and he went for it and he said, I don't care what happens on the other side of it. I'm doing this because God told me to do it. I'm not going to speak about every individual word in this room. You know, all the personal ones that you have of where you're going or where he's called you to be. But I know for sure, if you read James chapter 1, verse 17, it says that we have a good and perfect Father, the Father of lights, that he's from heaven above. And that if he's your Father, his goodness, his perfection, his light, his witness, his visibility, his heavenly identity, the thing that the Father has becomes your likeness.
Amen. Yes.
With perfection, you can read it. Matthew chapter 5. Jesus says you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. But we don't call ourselves perfect. Well, that's because you're thinking of it the way that we would talk about it in English. But the reality is, the way you're going to become perfect has nothing to do with what you're going to do, and it has everything to do with what you're going to believe and who you're going to associate with. If your source is perfect, then you are like that source and perfect. They asked Jesus the question, "Teacher, what good thing must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus says, "Why do you ask me what's good? Only God in heaven is good." Another clue. I am going to be associated with the goodness of God, not because of the good thing that I do, but because his goodness is inherent in my heart, and therefore I am good and perfect. That word for above, he's from heaven above. John chapter 3, verse 7. We call it born again, which is fine. The word again is above. You have to be born from above. Yes, you're born again too. You're born of heaven, though, is the point. You're born from it's a different birth canal that you're going through. It's a spiritual birth that's going to occur. So are you big to do it? Okay. That's all I need to hear. That's all I've ever wanted to hear. If you're big to do it, and I think a lot of us are, we saw the group, right? We're big to take on a new identity. That identity is God authored. It's not one that we're deciding for you. It's not one that, like I said, for me, it's not one that I'm going to get by listening to another preacher. I'm born of the word that's inside of me and given to me. Are you going to be born of the word that's given to you? Are you willing to reject the things that stand in the way of actually living out that word? If you could do that, I have fantastic news, which is that we're going to continue to be on the rise more and more and more and more. And that thing about being associated with God's light, that light is going to be, it's like Gideon. All it took was one act of disobedience against a false heritage. And once he did that, he became visible. And it just incites something, right? That other people, they don't want to live subject to a false narrative about their lives. And if you can make that become something they can see, of this is a false narrative over your life and there's something better that's meant to be in place of it, people are going to be attracted to it. It's going to be like light.